Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. We put it together here for you at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, and I was reminded by a listener last weekend that we used to keep a website at tertiumquids.org, and we rechanged that to virginiainstitute.org. It seemed more direct, and people were able to find it. So if you're looking for us there, or go to our YouTube channel, which is Freedom and Prosperity Radio, and you can find previous editions of this program. Up next, under the banner, It's About Time, having been at Jamestown for the 400th anniversary of representative government, and then watched it just come spiraling out of control thanks to works of fiction masquerading as news articles in the New York Times. Peter Wood is on with us. He is the president of the National Association of Scholars. He's penned a great new book, which I got a chance to read a bit of. My schedule is not so much for long periods of time to read. It's terrific. It's called 1620, A Critical Response to the 1619 Project. Peter, thank you for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. And moreover, thank you for doing this. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well, and I appreciate your having me on.
Was your response the same as all of ours, and obviously more so because you took pen in hand and said, we've got to correct this? What was that first gut punch feeling when you were reading this stuff in of all places, the New York Times?
Well, I am a subscriber to the New York Times for my sins, and Sunday morning I got up this is in August of 2019, and opened up the paper to find the New York Times Magazine announcing its 1619 project. There's a big picture of the empty ocean on the cover of it, and I sat down immediately and read through the 100 pages and said, my goodness, something has to be done to respond to this. I responded that way because you could tell from the cover and the first pages inside that this was a remarkable assault on truthful history. The claim was that they were going to reframe all of American history in light of the idea that America became a slaveocracy in August of 1619, when a slave ship, or actually it was a pirate ship with some slaves that had been captured, came to Jamestown, Virginia, and traded their 20-some slaves for food. And from there, we're off to the races with all sorts of preposterous claims, like the idea that the American Revolution was fought in order to preserve the institution of slavery from the threat of British emancipating American slaves. Never happened. Mm-hmm. And the idea that American capitalism was the result of the plantation system in the South that invented capitalism, never mind the industrial North. But this sort of litany of preposterous claims over 100 pages of text just struck me as so outrageous I had to do something. So I'm the head of an organization called the National Association of Scholars. Monday morning I came in and called my staff together and said, we need to answer this. And on that moment, what we called our 1620 project was born. 1620 because that's the year in which the Mayflower arrived off the coast of Massachusetts, and the folks on board signed what we now call the Mayflower Compact, which is a distant precursor of the Declaration of Independence. It declares that the people on board, who were not all religious pilgrims, there were secular settlers as well, they were at each other's throats, and they decided they needed to come up with a charter of how they were going to govern themselves when they landed. And that document, the Mayflower Compact, I argue, is a much better early beginning of what became America, the United States, than the happenstance arrival of some slaves in Virginia the year before.
When we were in Jamestown for the 400th anniversary of the first convening of the Virginia General Assembly, the House of Burgesses at the time, some of the archaeologists there were giving presentations on the Portuguese pirate ship, and that had the settlers in Jamestown not already having realized that a socialist sort of collectivist farming community was not going to feed them, and had already begun becoming more mercantile, they had said to these Portuguese sailors, well, we'll get you food, but you need to give us something for them. And they had no money because they were on their way, I guess, to the Indies. And so they said, well, we have these slaves here. And I guess the mistake they made was, instead of saying, okay, I guess you're slaves, they should have just said, here, go find a piece of land and farm it. And maybe the whole story of America takes a different tack. But it was an interesting, because this was long before the New York Times piece or anything. It was so innocuous, and then all of a sudden to see this thing drop out of the sky, almost struck us all unawares.
Well, what dropped out of the sky was basically a myth. We know from careful examination of the records of Jamestown that the slaves that were brought on board the White Lion was the name of the ship, weren't treated as slaves. Jamestown did not have a status of slaves. What they had was a status of indentured servants. That's how they were meeting their labor demands. And the slaves were immediately turned into indentured servants. We know that because within a few years they were set free. Many of them became landowners. They intermarried with the whites. They became, in some cases, prosperous farmers. We even have one case where one of those ex-slaves sued a white neighbor in Jamestown court and won. So it's not a picture of the beginning of chattel slavery as we think of it. It's just happened to be a convenient year for the New York Times to say 400 years of oppression began that day. Well, it didn't. Actually, slavery as we know it took another 50 to 60 years to even get started in Virginia.
As a scholar, and this, I think, whether it be medical or sociological, knowing the actual story and knowing the facts helps with curing the ills of those misdeeds or mistakes of societal evolution, more than covering them up and pretending they never happened or exacerbating them to some ridiculous level that makes it look like that's all that was happening.
Right. Well, I'm a strong proponent of our teaching real history, and that means the history of America should include a rich and detailed account of how slavery became a fact, how we eventually cured it through the abolition movement and then through the Civil War and the 14th Amendment. We needed a kind of history that should be known to all Americans that includes this piece of it, but doesn't try to reduce all our history to just one thing, which is racial oppression.
Right.
The New York Times had a motive for doing this. It didn't come out of the blue. They were upset that President Trump had prevailed in the contest with the FBI special investigator, the Mueller Commission, and they spent part of the 2019 searching for an alternative narrative that would do harm to Trump's chances. They decided racism was it, and the 1619 Project was framed as an extension of that project, a larger project.
This program is flagged out of a little town in Virginia called Charlottesville, which up until it's don't believe what you see on CNN. When I was in the riots, I went down to broadcast from the riots because I wanted to see what actually happened. And I feel much in the same way you do about this 1619 Project. Every time I hear another news report or story about Charlottesville in 2017, we don't do ourselves any favors by mistelling or or half telling a story, because there are real heroic events in all things that go in there. Now, that said about Jefferson had some very strong things to say about slavery. He wrote a rebuke of the idea of just freeing the slaves with the stroke of a pen as well, saying you need to establish economy and sort of some of the things that he wrote this about, the idea that the freed slaves would need access to an economy and banking and a way to grow their civilization. Begins almost this reparational thought. And I know Lincoln was a Jeffersonian scholar. As somebody who is trying to get all to the realities of this, where does the reparational thought of today hold root into what happened after Lincoln was assassinated or after the Emancipation Proclamation and perhaps not finishing what Jefferson had warned we should do?
Well, certainly among the most shameful periods in American history was the failure after the Civil War to sustain and carry out in a constructive way the project of Reconstruction. And that meant that eventually the efforts to fully integrate the former slave population into a self-governing country fell to pieces under Jim Crow law and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and things like that. That's a history we should know, and we should know well. I think it's increasingly understood that Reconstruction ended up as a fiasco. And how did this relate? Well, had Lincoln lived, I think we would have had a different country. But as it happened, Andrew Johnson was not the man that we needed at the time after Lincoln's assassination. We were left with a failure to fully realize the dream of a nation that was genuinely treating all people as equal. That's a history I want known, but it's not a history in which we end up seeing blacks as nothing but victims and whites as nothing but oppressors, which is basically what the 1619 Project is pushing.
Peter, as president of the National Association of Scholars, I want to go beyond where we are right now and look into the future, because so many of what you would consider to be scholars, and not university, but in our high school levels where kids are starting to develop their attitudes and hone them, are more narrators than scholars. They're not pushing intellectual pursuit based on factual historical reportings, and I worry that we're not going to get that back. Is there a peril that, what we lose, we're not going to get back, and how do we save that?
Well, there definitely is a peril in this. Since I'm talking about the 1619 Project, it's part of the peril, but certainly not all of it. We've had for a while now one of the most popular, by some accounts the most popular history textbook in our schools is Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. That document is just as mythological as the 1619 Project is, but again, it's not a single source of mischief. It's many forms of mischief, much of which come through schools of education, which tend to be the most radicalized part of the academy. So many of our teachers have already been trained in a unconstructive and often false view of U.S. history. They bring that to the students absorb it. It's also become very much part of popular culture. The propagandizing of America from the far left has proceeded to the point where I think a great many Americans are now unable to recognize the difference between history grounded on documents and proven facts and just these stories that get made up. Is there a danger? I think the danger is that we learn to hate our own country. That has been the bottom line of this new history, that America is a despicable place founded on exploitation and oppression, has been from the beginning. the history of the West is a history of genocide and slavery. Everything from Columbus onward is to be something to be ashamed of. The points of actual progress are ignored, and the idea that there is in all of human life a mixture of good and bad, achievement and unworthy acts has been erased by this very simplistic attempt to depict the past as a source of shame and nothing else.
What do we need to do? What do I need to do? I know you're doing your part. What do each one of us need to do to stem that tide? I know that my dinner table was often not deprogramming, but contextualizing what our kids would come home and we'd talk about it. I know other parents that don't want to hear it. They're like, oh, that's, and they create this wall in between their kids and themselves over what they're hearing in school. I think being able to accept, okay, Zinn may be in the classroom. How do we fight back against that narrative? What do we have to show them to, say, okay, this is more of a bedtime story than a history book. How do we give us some tools that we can use, the listener can use to fight back against this?
Well, of course, if a parent knows some history himself or herself and is able to talk about it in an easy and familiar way, that does a lot. That tells the child, whether he's listening or half tuning out, that there's something more here that I'm not hearing in my classroom. I do think parents have a responsibility to get serious about the kinds of people that they elect to local school boards and stuff like that. But when it comes to actually talking to your children, being informed and knowledgeable yourself goes a long way. I know people are busy. No one wants to sit down and read tedious old books of history that they've long forgotten. But knowing some of that history is really important. And I think the stories that get told in schools need to be matched by equally vivid or more vivid stories of what really happened. That's part of what I set out to do in 1620. I think no story has become drearier to Americans than hearing of the first Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims and their pointy hats and that sort of thing. It didn't happen that way. It's a much richer, more interesting, entertaining story if you can just take a few minutes to learn what really was happening. In the case of the Pilgrims, it's a story of a bunch of people blown off course. They expected that they would be arriving somewhere around New York. Instead, they were blown onto this rocky, desolate coast in Massachusetts, and the people on board, some of them being religious dissenters, but many of them being just would-be settlers, declared that they were now free to go where they want and do what they want because they were outside British law. And with the recognition that a kind of anarchy was about to befall them, and they had no idea what kind of reception they would get from the natives on shore, they came up in the last minute. They were just not sure how they were going to survive with this idea of let's make a compact. And my goodness, they created the first model of self-government that the world had ever seen. This was a improvised, under pressure act of creation in which they decided that they were going to live under the rule of law, they were going to elect their own leaders, that they were going to handle people equally. They had masters and servants, the rich, the poor, everybody agreeing to follow the same set of rules. Once they were landed, they reached a treaty with the Wampanoag Indians that was to last for half a century. So peace with their neighbors, peace with each other, rule of law, those were things that you could take for granted in the early 17th century. And it's breathtaking that they survived. More than half of them died, or almost half of them died during that first winter. Those that survived, almost a majority of them were under age 20. so it was a kind of orphanage in the New World, and yet that became the model of how we settled this country as a whole. It wasn't the House of Burgesses in Virginia that set out as the pattern that made America a settled place under the rule of law. It was emulation of what these handful of people in early Massachusetts were able to achieve. Now, that's a breathtaking story, and I defy any cynical teenager to really hear it and come away thinking that the Howard Zinn version of history is the right one.
Well, and it's available on Amazon now, Peter?
It is. It is. Yeah.
You get it at Amazon. There's Kindle version, hardcover as well. Get it, share it with kids. Christmas gifts are coming up. You can't deny that. And thank you so much for your visit. And thank you, moreover, for doing this project and putting this together, you and your whole team there at the National Association of Scholars.
Okay, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thank you all for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Next week will be Thanksgiving, so for all of us, appropriately, to talk about this here. So long, and thanks for all the turkey.